Hello everyone, this is lesson 9.4, solve quadratic equations using square roots. So yesterday you learned, before you learned how to solve quadratic equations by factoring, yesterday you learned how you can use Desmos to solve quadratic equations by looking at the zeros. And today we're going to learn how we can solve a quadratic equation without a calculator, but just solving and taking the square root to solve for x. So the thing about this, though, is that for this lesson, it's only going to work if your equation is either in vertex form or if you don't have an x term. But it'll tell you which method you should solve. So if you should solve using square roots, it'll tell you just so that you're clear. And we're also going to learn when you can figure out if it has 2, 1, or 0 solutions. Remember yesterday, graphically, if it had 2 solutions, it crossed through the x-axis twice. If it had 1 solution, it crossed through the x-axis at just one point, the vertex. And if it had no solutions, it didn't cross through the x-axis at all. And so here, this says solving x squared equals some number. So if we wanted to solve for x, we would just take the square root of both sides, because that's the opposite of what x squared is. And you have a button in your calculator for taking the square root. Sometimes you'll get a decimal, sometimes you'll get a whole number, or sometimes it might ask you to leave your answer in radical form, which means that you would just write square root of 7, for example, instead of the decimal version. Also, you won't be able, don't use your calculator for this lesson or Desmos calculator. You can use your regular calculator. Whatever calculator button it gives you in Edge Elastic is the calculator that you're allowed to use, as well as your graphing calculator. So if it doesn't give you the Desmos graphing calculator, then you shouldn't be using it. You should only be using the scientific one. Okay, so here's some first examples. So here, if we wanted to solve for x, we would first divide by the 2 on both sides. So we get x squared equals 4. Then, if we wanted to solve for x, we would take the square root of both sides. Now, here's the thing. This is x equals, so what's the square root of 4? Well, if you type it in your calculator, it'll give you 2. But we're also asking what values of x such that when squared will give us 4. So that would be 2 squared, but that could also be negative 2 squared. Because if you square negative, then the negatives cancel. So whenever we do the square root of a number when we're solving for x, we want to write plus or minus 2. All right, that's going to be really important moving forward. Okay, and also, graphically speaking, I know I said don't use Desmos, but just to give you an idea of what this equation would look like, if I subtracted the 8 from both sides and got 2x squared minus 8, this looks like this parabola. So it opens up because it's positive, and it goes through negative 2 and positive 2. So these are kind of examples. If the solutions are the same, then the vertex is halfway in between them, which would be on the y-intercept. So here, the vertex is the same thing as the y-intercept. It won't always be like that, but it would be important to look for that. All right, number 2. So we'll subtract the 12 over this time since it's being added. So we get b to the second equals 5 minus 12 is negative 7. And if you try to take the square root of negative 7 in your calculator, it's going to give you an error message because you actually can't take the square root of a negative number. Think about it. If you were to square any number, it can never give you a negative number. So if you tried to do the opposite, take the square root of a negative number, it will never give you a positive number. Now, you would then say no solution if you try to take the square root of a negative number. And it gives you an error message. There's also one little thing that you might be interested in is even though this has no real solution, it does have an imaginary solution. So the imaginary solution, a little tidbit, you don't need to know this for a test, but the square root of negative 1 is called the imaginary number I. And if you square I, then you get negative 1. Because if you square this, then the square root just cancels out and you're left with negative 1. So that could appear on a bonus question, like writing the negative number. So you would write this as the square root of 7 I. Or whatever square root of 7 is, 2 point whatever I. Okay, for number 3, here I'm going to divide by 4, but I'm not actually going to divide 9 by 4. I'm just going to write it as a fraction, because what I notice about 9 and 4 is that they're both perfect squares. So if I take the square root of a, I'm really taking the square root of the numerator and the square root of the denominator when I square root this side. And the square root of 9 is 3, the square root of 4 is 2, and then I would do plus or minus in front. You could also rewrite your final equation as plus or minus 1.5. For 4, this is a 2-step equation. Well, really 3 steps for the square root part, but you would add 11. So 3x squared equals 18. Divide by 3, and you get x squared equals 6. I don't know what the square root of x squared is, so I'm just going to leave it as plus or minus the square root of 6. So if it says don't round or write an unrounded answer, then that means to leave it in the square root. Or an exact answer. This is an exact answer, unrounded. And also, if you did type it into Desmos graphing calculator, it would give you the decimal and not the square root part. So you want to make sure you know how to do this. All right, so what do we have here? We have something being squared, which is always the last thing that we do. So first we have 6 times that. So it's going to treat it like 6 times something squared. So first we would divide by the 6. And then you have x minus 4 squared equals 7. Now, if we were being asked to simplify this, then we would take x minus 4 and rewrite it as x minus 4 times x minus 4 to FOIL and then distribute the 6. That's not what we're asked to do, though. We're asked to solve. So if you're asked to solve and if you have something like this, then don't FOIL. So don't FOIL. There's a different method that we're going to learn in this lesson. Okay, so then you have these parentheses. X minus 4 is stuck in the parentheses, so we can't add the 4 until we take the square root. I'm going to take the square root. I'm going to leave this as the square root of 7, so don't use your calculator until the very end. So this is left with x minus 4 equals, remember when we square root, we do plus or minus square root of 7. So the step that you do the square rooting, you need to do the plus or minus. You might want to make a little note about that. All right, and then to get the x by itself, we will add 4 to both sides. And I like to add it afterwards, so we would have x equals plus or minus the square root of 7 plus 4. Notice I put like a little hat after the 7 just to note that the square root ends at 7. You might want to do that so that you don't get mixed up. Okay, now this actually gives us 2 answers. This gives us positive square root 7 plus 4, and it also gives us negative square root 7 plus 4. So let's say that it then asked us to get the decimal answer, to write this in unrounded version and then the decimal answer. So you would type this in as positive square root 7 and then arrow to get out of the square root plus 4. It gives you 6.65, and then negative square root 7. Make sure you keep the negative sign outside of the parentheses. Arrow out of the square root plus 4. And that gives us 1.35. So 6.45 and 1.35. If you found the vertex of this equation, it would be exactly in between those. So for example, if you were to take this 1.35, add it to 6.65, and then take the average of those, the vertex would be at 2. Oh, I'm sorry, I divided it by 4. Never mind, 8 divided by 2 is 4. So the vertex is at 4, and that makes sense because there's a 4 right here. So the vertex is at 4. It's actually 4 negative 42, because if you subtract the 42 over, that would be the k. And if you put this in Desmos, that's what you would find. Okay, I'm going to delete this stuff here so I have room for number 6. Clear ink. Okay, so for 6, the first step is to divide by the 4. So we have q plus 3 squared equals 7. And then we want to take the square root of both sides. And then you've got q plus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 7. And then you have to subtract the 3. So we got q equals plus or minus the square root of 7 minus 3, which is actually 2 answers. It's positive square root 7 minus 3 and negative square root 7 minus 3. Okay, you can type those in your calculator to figure out the decimals. Okay. And then I think I have a little challenge problem below that. Yeah, so here. So for this one, the only thing, okay, there's a couple things here. So first we would add the 8 over. So you get 2 times 3x plus 1 squared equals 8. Okay, divide by the 2. 3x plus 1 squared equals 4. Take the square root. 3x plus 1 equals plus or minus square root of 4 is 2. And then we would subtract the 1. So we would have 3x equals plus or minus 2 minus 1. And then we would divide by 3. When you divide by 3, you want to divide the entire thing by 3 and just write it as a fraction like that. Okay, then you're going to break this up into 2 different fractions. It's going to be 2 minus 1 over 3 and negative 2 minus 1 over 3. So if I simplified this fraction, I would get 1 over 3, so 1/3. If I simplified this fraction, I would get negative 3 over 3, which is negative 1. So the challenge part to that was the fact that the x is now being multiplied by something, so we would divide it at the very end and break it up into 2 different fractions. Okay, and then on the next page was really just additional practice that kids did in class. So I might do 1, 2. Let's do 2. Okay, so let's do number 1. So try number 1. All right, so you would add the 11, and then take m squared equals 28. The square root of that gives you plus or minus the square root of 28, which is plus or minus 5.39. Right, and then let's do one of the harder ones. Oh, let's do number 5. So for number 5, don't forget that when you divide by 25, don't simplify it until you take the square root. So you divide by the 25, 16 over 25, and then when you take the square root, you take the square root of 16 and the square root of 25, which gives you plus or minus 4/5. And then for these ones, don't forget that you have to divide by the 2 and then take the square root and then add the 2. So that would be x minus 2 squared equals 9. X minus 2 equals plus or minus 3, because the step you take the square root in, you have to do the plus or minus. Add the 2. So then this would be positive 3 plus 2, which is 5, and negative 3 plus 2, which is negative 1. So those are your 2 answers for that one. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. You'll get more practice in your Edge Elastic. You guys have a great day.